We are going to start with Francesco Bianchi, who is going to speak about perceptions of public debt and policy expectations, evidence from cross-country surveys, and the discussant will be Eric Mengus. Francesco, the floor is yours.
So first of all, thanks a lot for including the paper in the program. This is a joint work with ERA, Dabla-Norris, and Salma, Khalid, that is also at the MF. Okay, so what we are interested in this paper is to understand how the public thinks about fiscal policy. So I don't need to explain to this audience that post-pandemic we had an important increase in debt to GDP ratio. But this went to add to a pre-existing trend, in the sense that debt to GDP ratio had been increasing for a while across several countries. And if you look at also the global economy, basically we have the debt to GDP ratio is an historical maximum. And now what we know also is that the debt to GDP ratio could have been even higher if it had not been for a large part of inflation that we had post-pandemic. So this used to be a little bit more of a problem of emerging economies that you have on the right-hand side here, but now clearly we have large stocks of debt in advanced economies as well. And naturally, we are having a conversation about how we are going to undo this, how we are going to build a little bit of fiscal space for the next recession. So at the same time, we know that fiscal adjustments are quite unpopular. In fact, ERA in another paper documented that actually disappeared from from the political discourse. In the sense, if you look at manifestos of different parties, essentially they don't talk about fiscal policy that much anymore, if not about redistributing some resources across people, but there is really no attempt of saying how we are going to pay for all of this. On top of that, more like on, let's say, the academic side of this debate, so we actually had a very nice keynote speech yesterday from Marius that spoke of these aspects. So in our models, we typically have a representative agent that is perfectly informed. At the very least, we want to think about heterogeneity in agents, and that was the focus of Marius' talk yesterday. Here we are going to take a little bit of a different angle with respect to the heterogeneity and try to understand how informed different agents are with respect to fiscal issues. So this paper asks a lot of questions. So this is actually the first time that I personally present it. So this is also going to be useful to understand what we should focus our attention on, because there are a lot of very interesting results. And I'll try to emphasize a couple of them. But we ask questions starting from the very high level, how much people understand of how fiscal policy works, how the government budget constraint works, down to how they think adjustments will occur. Do they think they will occur at their expenses or at somebody else's expenses? Do they think that they will be effective? And we are going to focus quite a bit on does previous experience with fiscal consolidations matter for their beliefs about how effective or what kind of policies will be implemented? And finally, in the last part of the paper, we are also going to check what kind of causal effect informing agents of the current fiscal situation has on their beliefs, on their expectations about the future. So let me summarize the main results. As I was saying, I'm going to try to focus on a couple of them. There is more in the paper, but here, also in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on what I find particularly interesting. So the first key result is that for the general population, fiscal knowledge is quite limited. There seems to be really a little bit of a hard time in even understanding the basic math of how the government budget constraint works. At the same time, there is a small fraction of the population that tends to be wealthier and higher educated and older that instead seems to understand these dynamics way better. And again, thinking about heterogeneity, perhaps we want to start thinking about models in which there is a smaller fraction of the population, potentially that is the one pricing bonds, that actually understands how the government budget constraint works. In general, there is a tendency to underestimate debt in high debt countries. So what that means is that people might not be even fully aware of how complicated the fiscal situation is. And there is an expectation that most of the adjustments will happen on taxes. And this is relevant because it confirms a little bit the prior that once you start establishing some benefits, it's really hard to take them back. The other interesting results is that agents seem to have a sort of pessimism with respect to who will pay for this fiscal adjustment when it will occur. They all think that it will disproportionately fall on themselves. And I'm going to try to connect to some literature with respect to this. And finally, I'm going to talk about what happens when you inform them of the current fiscal situations. There seems to be the right movement in the sense that once you explain to them that debt is higher than what they thought, agents tend to expect higher taxes or lower spending, but this varies a lot depending on the trajectory of the country and if the agents had previous experience with fiscal consolidations. Okay, so let me just jump into the survey. So this is a survey that we conduct with the YouGov, and of course the IMF was the other co-partner. And the period, we look at April, May 2024, and it's a pretty representative survey of this set of countries that you see here. And you can see that it's a very heterogeneous group of countries. So for advanced economy, we have Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, UK, and the US. So we have a wide spectrum of economies across different regions. And for emerging economies, we also try to pick some countries that we believe are representative of a certain type. So we have Argentina and Brazil on one side, and Hungary and Poland on the other side, so two ex-Soviet bloc countries. Without getting into all the details, we check the background of the respondents, their demographics, their self-reported income, their self-reported wealth, meaning if they own financial assets, if they have investment portfolios, and so on and so forth. We check their beliefs. We check their beliefs in general about the quality of the government, how much you can trust the government, but then more factually about how large the debt to GDP ratio is in your country, what do you think the taxes are high or low, and then we move to essentially the key part of our survey, that is, what are the policy expectations in light of your beliefs? What do you think is going to happen to taxes, spending, and within these two broad categories, how exactly you think that fiscal adjustment is going to occur? And finally, we're also interested in understanding if agents think there is going to be a role for inflation in all of these, and how effective these fiscal stabilizations will be. Okay, so let me start with the first part, in a sense, the basic understanding. So how well do people understand the government budget constraint, and how accurate are their beliefs about the current fiscal situations, and also what kind of heterogeneity we find in the data. Okay, so here is a very colorful table. So here, as usual, blue means good, red means not so good. And these questions that we are asking here is basic government budget constraint math. So for example, what happens to the deficit if you increase the spending? Or what happens to the deficit if you reduce the spending? So there seems to be, first of all, you can see there is a lot of red. What that means is that for many questions, agents tend to give the wrong answer. Literally, they think that the variables are going to move in the opposite direction of what is in fact true. There seems to be a difference with respect to how you ask the question. So people seem to have a little bit of problems with double negatives. So even if you ask the same economic concept, they seem to understand better what happens to a deficit if you increase spending with respect if you decrease spending. So that might be some kind of behavioral bias, or it might be literally that they have a hard time really thinking about the double negative. But in general, you can see that even when we are looking at the correct answer, the top country in these dimensions is the Netherlands. That would be the fourth column here. And you still have a fairly limited percentage of people that give the right answer. So here is 72%. So in general, there seems to be a fairly large fraction of the population, perhaps because they don't care, because maybe it's not relevant to them, that they haven't really spent much time thinking about the government budget constraint and even the simple math behind it. However, once you start digging more, things look a little bit richer than this, in the sense, while it's true that if you take a random sample of the population, you will find several people that seem to have a hard time in understanding the government budget constraint, when you look at their characteristics, you find that once agents are wealthier and older, they tend to give the right answer. So here we do this in two ways. So on the left-hand side, we do this with a regression. in which we basically build a score of how accurate the responses of a particular respondent are. On the right-hand side, we use a random forest that is just a way to figure out which characteristics are more predictive of somebody giving the correct answers. And as I was saying, we find that mostly wealth and age are the driving force. Now, thinking about what that means for our economic models, again, we might think that there is a small fraction of the population that has a lot of wealth for which these things matter, and so they spend more time thinking about the current fiscal state and what happens if you change things around. The other key question that we ask in terms of basic knowledge is, what do you think the debt-to-GDP ratio in your country currently is? And so the diamond here, the blue diamond here, is what actually the debt-to-GDP ratio is in the different countries, and then you have what people responded. And on the left-hand side, you have the current value. The right-hand side, there is what you think is going to be in 5 years. So what you can see is that for countries that have low debt-to-GDP ratio, relatively low debt-to-GDP ratio, answers are actually quite accurate. So it's not like people are completely oblivious to what happens. But countries that have high levels of debt-to-GDP ratio, agents tend to really underestimate how high the debt-to-GDP ratio is. And again, this might speak of the fact that these debates kind of were progressively removed from the political discourse. In a sense, we simply ignore it, and so people are less informed about these issues, or at least how severe the issues are. And even in this case, of course, we find that people that have larger financial wealth are more likely to report the correct answer. I'm going to skip this. It's basically saying that everybody feels that debt is too high, spending is too high, taxes are too high, but somehow we don't do anything about it, but it's actually remarkable. But in general, there is an expectation that debt will rise or stay high. Again, this is important. There is only one exception, Argentina. And that's interesting because this was around the time that Milei got elected. So in Argentina, people actually felt that debt was going to come down. So this is remarkable because it simply means that people really don't expect anything to be done about these key issues of our times. OK, so when it comes to the policy beliefs, of course, this is what people think the current fiscal situation is. We are interested in understanding how they think is going to be resolved, okay? So the first thing we find is that tax increases are way more expected than spending cuts. The other thing I found interesting here is that, oh, that's in the next slide, sorry. Let me anticipate it now, is that people don't expect military spending to actually be touched. And this could have two interpretations. One, because they realize that the times are different, geopolitical risk is high, or simply because in many of these countries, military spending is already quite low. But when it comes to this slide, you see there is a lot of blue in the bottom panel. What is that bottom panel? That's the likelihood of the government increasing taxes. So it's the top part of the table says very likely. So it means that people expect that a lot of the adjustment will be done through taxation. And again, when we think about the economics of these, it can be a little bit of a problem in the sense that in many of these countries, taxation is already elevated. And we know that they are not particularly efficient. So this also creates a little bit of a cloud for the future, because there is really this perception that once you implement large welfare programs, it's really hard to undo them, or at least to reduce them. This is the table that instead asks the time horizon. Many people think that taxes will increase in the very short run instead for spending much less. Let me skip this one too in the interest of time. The other thing that we found that it's remarkable is that most agents think that the fiscal adjustment will fall on themselves. So here we start from a very broad type of questions. Basically, we give the respondents a menu of possible fiscal adjustments. So let's focus on the bottom table. So that's increasing taxes. And then we ask them, do you think they are going to be on middle-income households? Do you think they are going to be on high-income households, on whole households, and so on and so forth? And so you see that there is a lot of expectations that will fall on middle-income households. But this is in population. Okay, so if you ask the overall population, there is expectation it will fall on the middle-income households. And we know that that's where most of the tax base is. But then once within each country, once you look at the characteristics of the different respondents, you find that the respondents tend to think that if they are high wealth, they think that the wealthy people are going to be taxed. If they are middle income people, they think that middle income people will be taxed. If they are retirees, they think that pensions will be cut or reduced, and so on and so forth. Again, if we think about our economic models, we assume rational expectation agents. Clearly, this speaks of something different. It speaks of some sort of ambiguity aversion for which, if there is uncertainty about how a certain issue will be resolved, you always assume the worst case scenario, but the worst case scenario is the worst case scenario for you. So there's also probably a little bit of a tendency of not fully capturing the general equilibrium aspects of all of these. So what that means is that my worst case scenario is simply I will be taxed more. I don't really think about, okay, how that is going to work out for the whole economy. I just think that individually I'm going to be taxed more. And so that's also a direction. So going back to my implications of what we find, I would say heterogeneity in beliefs, and second, possibly ambiguity aversion, that once you don't really put a solution on the table to a problem, agents just move to the worst case scenario. And so this was for taxes, this is for spending, okay? So for spending is the same thing. If they benefit of a certain welfare program, they tend to think that that will be reduced. Okay, so then what we are interested in is if prior beliefs are going to matter for what they expect, okay? And so what we find is that the prior beliefs and expectations of future debt increases, meaning if agents think that debt is going to go up, again correlates with high expectations of tax increases. So this goes back to my previous point that when people think there is the fiscal situation needs to be resolved, they tend to think that this will be mostly on taxes as opposed to spending. Let me again skip this in the interest of time. Another interesting aspect is to check how all these perceptions change based on the lived experience. So there is a literature, the most relevant paper is probably Malmendier and Nagel, that discuss how beliefs about how the economy works or what's going to happen in the future are disproportionately influenced by the personal experience of an individual. So in our case, what is relevant is whether if an individual lived or not during a fiscal consolidation. So we build this indicator for each individual that basically keeps track of if the individual experience fiscal consolidation during her working life, and how far in the past that was. If it's more recent, of course, it's fresh in your memory, so that should influence your beliefs more than if something happened in the past. And then we want to check how this influences beliefs for agents. And in particular, a past experience, if somebody has had a past experience of fiscal consolidation, in average, that's going to lower the perception of current debt and the level of spending and taxes. So now, when you think about these, given that most people overestimate in high debt countries the level of debt, so that means that people are a bit more aware of the correct level. And symmetrically, going back to my previous point that people think that fiscal issues are mostly going to be resolved through taxations, if you have past consolidation experience, the expectations of a tax increase is going to go up. Okay, so again, people seem to have this perception that any fiscal solution will mostly involve taxes, and this seems to be more true if they live through a fiscal consolidation. Now, the other thing that we are interested in is what do these beliefs do to the perception about the future? Are agents thinking that the future is brighter once we are done these fiscal consolidations, or the other way around? And in general, we find across a different, very broad set of questions that the experience of past consolidations make people less optimistic about the future. And this is across very different ranges, starting from, will the fiscal consolidation work? That would be the first set of regressions. And in general, the perception is like, no, they won't work. And up to are you going to be better off, you personally, after this fiscal consolidation, and so on and so forth. So there seems to be pessimism both about the effectiveness of any fiscal consolidation and also in terms of what will happen to my personal circumstances. This is an interesting result that we are currently exploring more, because it might have something to do that, in a sense, in our sample, there are some repeated offenders that go through repeated fiscal consolidations. And in a sense, if you have a fiscal consolidation but without resolving the underlying issues, you might be up for another fiscal consolidation later on. And when you think about this idea that most fiscal consolidations involve an increase in taxes but not really a change in spending, one possible explanation is that if you have essentially too generous welfare programs with respect to what you can extract in terms of tax revenues, these are going to stay with you longer, especially with an aging population. And so you might get into these repeated fiscal issues unless you structurally address the underlying problem. Okay, so in the last 4 minutes and a half that I have, I'm going to talk about the treatments that we implemented. So we started with the very simple, the simplest thing we could think of, informing agents of the debt level. Treatment number 2, a subset of these agents were also informed of the accounting of the government budget constraint. We basically told them, explain a bit better what happens when you change deficits, what happens to debt, what happens when you change taxes, what happens to deficit, and so on and so forth. Basically, we explained to them the government budget constraint. And finally, the third one, it's instead of telling them simply where debt is today, we also tell them where it's projected to go. So that should give them a better sense of the issue, because you can have a large stock of debt that is expected to decline, like arguably happened after World War II, or you might have a high stock of debt that is expected to increase, like the current situation. So again, let me skip this in the interest of time. So what we find is that the treatments work in the sense that they move beliefs about what's going to happen in the right direction. So again, let's go back to what I was saying in the very beginning. People seem to be a bit confused about exactly how the government budget constraint works, but somehow when you tell them debt is higher than what you thought, they actually reduce they actually move expectations of tax increases in the right direction, meaning once they learn that debt is higher, the expectations of tax increases goes down. And then when they are informed, so when it comes to expectations of spending cuts, what matters to them. So on the left, let me explain something important here. On the first column over here, I'm looking at countries for which debt was stable over the sample. So these are agents that actually learn that debt is lower than what they thought. Okay, so that's column 1. So if they learn that debt is lower than what they thought, then naturally they should expect that tax increases are less likely. And that's exactly what we find. You don't find that in the second column where the agents learn that debt is higher than what they thought. Okay, so in that sense, sorry, I skipped this part, it's important. Of course, you inform them of debt, but what matters is what their prior beliefs were. And so if you are in a country in which debt is actually low, people tend to learn that debt is lower than what they thought. If you're in a country that debt is high, agents learn that debt is higher than what they thought. Okay? And so you can see that for countries where agents learn that debt is higher than what they thought, that would be the last column over there, the expectation of a spending cut goes up, meaning again, they realize that something will have to give. Then, of course, all of this depends on what their prior beliefs were. And then all of this also is influenced by past consolidation. In particular, past consolidation amplifies the effects of these treatments, in the sense they become more powerful, especially with respect on expectations of spending cuts in country with rising debt. Again, here what matters is that agents learn that debt is higher than what they thought. Okay, so I'm almost out of time, so let me conclude with a brief summary of what the policy implications are. So we spend a lot of time on communicating monetary policy. Clearly, we spend much less time on communicating fiscal policy and the relevant trade-offs. I think these started occurring more often. So we were actually, before the panel, the session, we were talking about how in France, Guillaume actually got a little bit more into the public debate and explained the trade-offs when it comes to taxations. But definitely we could do more, and we could possibly learn something by central bank communication. When it comes to economics, I think I try to outline to you what the directions for future research, in our opinion, are based on these results, and to think about heterogeneity in beliefs, heterogeneity in wealth related to these beliefs. Some people are more informed than others, perhaps because it matters more to them. And finally, this idea that perhaps Asians tend to be ambiguity averse. Once they have uncertainty, they always think that things are going to be bad for them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Also for sticking to the time constraint.
Despite being Italian.
Eric.
Okay. So
it's coming, I think.
The slides, yeah, thank you. So thanks to the organizer for inviting me to discuss these extremely interesting papers on perception of public debt. Okay, so I mean, we all know that large level of public debt is now a quasi-global phenomenon. There are only a few exceptions, and this requires policies. A lot of policies, like both on the monetary side and on the fiscal side. But we have also one problem here, that in morals, we know that those policies and the efficiency of those policies depends a lot on the way the private sector, either firms or households, think about fiscal policies. And the problem we have, we as academics, is that still little is known about the effect and the perception by the private agents of those policies. And so this paper is actually providing us with a lot of evidence from multiple countries to think about those issues somewhat more. And so let me skip the summary of the paper. Francesco did an amazing job already on this to tell you a little bit more about how I see the paper. So this paper is actually providing a strong push to this literature on the way households think about fiscal policy and think about fiscal and public finance, sorry. And this has a lot of implication for fiscal and monetary policy. There is a lot of food for thought in the paper. So what I'm going to talk about in this discussion are three main points. The first one that I learned by reading this paper is that fiscal consolidation may backfire, and may backfire along multiple dimensions. I'm going to talk about long-run growth, I'm going to talk about the effect on fiscal consolidation itself, and I'm going to talk also about inflation. The second thing is there's also an understanding of the recent period in the paper. And this has to do with why fiscal consolidation contributes to lower trust and to pessimism among households. And the last point is that the paper gives us a lot of food for thought also on a concept that is key to think about fiscal policy and in its interaction with monetary policy, which is fiscal space. So I'm going to have also some couple of words on that topic. Okay, so let me start with the first point. I think that in the paper, we have a new channel to think about fiscal stagnation. Yesterday, Luca presented a paper in which higher taxes will reduce incentives to innovate, or he mentions also in this paper that it can go through public spending via the supply of public goods. But here in the paper, you have a new channel for this. Actually, fiscal consolidation and the experience of fiscal consolidation will have an effect on trust and on pessimism. This, we know from the literature on growth, that this has an effect on long-term growth. We have plenty of evidence that actually lower institutional growth, lower institutional trust leads to lower growth in the long run. And there are many papers on the topic, starting with the paper by Yann Algan and Pierre Cahuc. So this leads me to a couple of comments on this connection. We want to know a little bit more. In the questionnaire of the survey, we have also a question regarding interpersonal trust. So it's not necessarily the most directed variable, but perhaps there is also an effect on the way people think about their relationship to others in the context in which there is fiscal consolidation putting pressure on everybody in the society. And we also know that interpersonal trust from this growth literature is an important driver of long-run growth. A second question is also about the portability of experience of fiscal consolidation. So suppose that I was in a country, I experienced fiscal consolidation, I should think that, oh, that's not good for the macroeconomy, I trust less governments. So if I immigrate to another country, do I have still some effect of that experience when immigrating? So that's something that this growth literature has pushed forward, and it would be also interesting to think about this kind of connection in the context of your survey. Okay, but there is something that I cannot prevent myself to make a connection while reading the paper. A graph that I'm showing to my student at HEC Paris is the following one. So there's a graph from the World Economic Outlook so by the IMF in 2 years ago. This graph is about the effect of fiscal consolidation on the debt to GDP ratio. So here, on the X line, you have 0 corresponds to the year of the implementation of fiscal consolidation, and then you have the subsequent years. So the effect, if any, of fiscal consolidation is that debt to GDP ratio is not going down, it's going up. So it's precisely what we don't want with fiscal consolidation. So there is a natural question. Is there any sort of fiscal consolidation fatigue? You experience fiscal consolidation, but it's not delivering on the main variable of interest. So my question then was, okay, is it the case in the sample of countries covered by the survey? And the answer is yes. Let me give you an example with France. So that's the debt to GDP ratio for France, and the shaded area corresponds to periods of fiscal consolidation. So you have a lot of period of fiscal consolidation in France. It's like between 30 and 40%. But look at the GDP ratio. It has increased by a lot. Is it the case only for France? The answer is no. For a large set of the countries in the sample, you have fiscal consolidation corresponding to between 20 and 40% of the years covered by the survey. And second, if you accept Japan, you put Japan aside, countries with higher debt in 2024 at the end of the survey have actually spent many more years doing fiscal consolidation. Just to give you a number, if you spend 1 additional year of fiscal consolidation, it's associated with a higher debt to GDP ratio of about 10 percentage points. Okay? So in a way, perhaps also the causality can go in the other direction. You need fiscal consolidation when you have large debt. But overall, I'm not sure that the households make that connection. They simply see a lot of fiscal consolidation and still very large level of debt. Okay, so this leads me to 2 comments. One is about what you can do with the survey. So in the survey, it's also possible to distinguish between successful and less successful fiscal consolidation. So either using the fiscal consolidation variable and say, okay, perhaps some of them did succeed to reduce the debt to GDP ratio and some of them did not. Or it's also possible to look directly at the effect on debt to GDP ratio. But it's also connected to a potential other story behind the fiscal consolidation. And Francesco touches a little bit the topic during his presentation. It's also possible that actually all those fiscal consolidation was of very limited efficacy. And the main reason is perhaps that they did not touch the deep, important problems that can be connected to welfare programs, think about pensions, think about healthcare, that are slowly drying up fiscal resources, especially with aging, and people see those problems still running on despite a lot of years of fiscal consolidation. So that, for me, it's connected to the idea of insidious fiscal dominance that Eric Lipper mentioned in a column in 2023. And he's saying that in a way this idea is connected to the fact that governments may actually kick the can down the road and do not implement those deep reforms, focusing perhaps on less efficient measures, with the idea that perhaps at some point they are going to be rescued by the monetary authority. And this is one point that I'm also pushing forward with from co-authors Jean-Barthélemy and Guillaume Plantin, that actually it's maybe optimal for government to do so, and even to not only to postpone adjustment, but also to double down on debt in those kind of context. Okay, so this connects actually now with my second implication on monetary policy. So you've seen in Francesco's presentation that there is a connection between experience of fiscal consolidation and the potential effect on inflation. It's associated with higher inflation expectation. So one very natural question we may ask here is it something that Francesco is an expert on? Is it fiscal dominance? Or is it something more connected with pessimism? With pessimism, about pessimism, the idea is simply that households associate inflation as a bad outcome, and they connect that with bad macroeconomic outcomes in general, and we have evidence for this, for example, Binetti and Stancheva recently. The idea of fiscal dominance is different. It's connected with fiscal space. How much households think about the fiscal space of the government, and whether the fiscal space is limited, in which case they will connect debt expectation with inflation expectation. So this is connected with the evidence that Francesco provided in a recent paper with Barrow, and I have also some work with Philippe Andrade and other co-authors linking those, providing micro evidence of people's view, households' view about fiscal space and how they connect debt with inflation. But here there are two potential policy implications in the paper. The first one is that, if you're doing fiscal consolidation that does not work, the ultimate effect is that those people may expect higher inflation because of fiscal dominance risk. And so what we argue with Philippe and other co-authors is that actually those kind of fiscal dominance risk is something that is very hard to handle by monetary policy. It's not actually something that monetary policy can directly handle. It requires more fiscal discipline, and it's not so on the side of monetary policy. But then it relates to a second comment on communication. One of the policy implications of this paper is whether you need to communicate on public debt. And here the main problem with communicating is that it may backfire. The main reason is that if you increase that expectation on the household side, they may also translate those higher debt expectation into higher inflation expectation. So it may actually reinforce the problem. So at a minimum, this means that it's not only communicating about debt, which is important. It's also communicating about debt and efficient, not fiscal consolidation, but efficient fiscal consolidation. We need to convince households that it's not going to be solved by inflation, those debt problems. Okay, so then, I mentioned this concept about fiscal space, so I have 3 minutes to talk about it. So the paper has a lot of also very important messages on households' perceptions of fiscal space. And why? Because we know from that paper that fiscal space the perception of fiscal space is connected to the fact that also households think that they will pay a disproportionately large cost related to the fiscal consolidation. So if there is fiscal consolidation, I'm going to pay more tax, or I'm going to see less transfer towards me. So then, it means that if I have to think about their perception about fiscal space, I need to understand why they think that they cannot be taxed further, or they cannot, we cannot cut spending that those households benefit. And I think that there are two potential explanations for why you may think those things can be limited. The first one is a political economy one. I don't think that's possible because I'm part of an influent group, and the government, our pushback will push the government to withdraw that reform. The second explanation is much more economic in a way. It's a Laffer curve type of argument. I cannot be taxed because simply, I cannot pay, and so the government will not be able to raise any extra resources out of me. The paper can actually also try to dig a little bit further whether the political economy or the economic constraint explanation are important. Indeed, in the paper, we already know from some tables in the appendix, and there is a lot of materials in the paper, that what matters is actually, in terms of experience, are the spending-based consolidations. But we also have data on whether people are rich or poor, and we know their political inclination. So using both variables can give us some further information whether they think it's the political economy or the economic constraint that may be at stake here. Final point on fiscal space. In the end, the assumption here in the paper is that all the debt has to be paid either by primary surpluses or if not by inflation. But in the sample, we have many countries actually belonging to a monetary union, the euro area, and we know a little bit this in this institution. So we have in particular France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. And in the past, we did experience some transfers within that monetary union, and there are some evidence by Pierre-Olivier Gourin-Chaz and Philippe Martin and Todd Messer. So, but at the end, we also know that there is a joint budget constraint in this area, and there are some work by Sébastien in the room on the possibility that this leads to fiscal dominance. So the question is also how households think about those kind of budget constraint problems in a monetary union, whether they think that there may be some transfer from the rest of the area. Okay, so let me skip the last point and conclude. So I think it's a very important paper which pushes the frontier of knowledge on the way households perceived public finance and fiscal policy. I think it's very important to have those evidence for the way high debt countries are going to manage their high level of debt. And what is important here is that we open a lot of new dimension to understand those beliefs. Political economy is one dimension, experience in another, and all this has critical implication, of course, for monetary and fiscal policies. Thanks a lot.
Good, thank you, Eric. We collect, as usual, a few questions before moving on. Okay, we start here on the right-hand side.
Thank you, Jacopo Cimadomo from the ECB. Thanks, Francesco and Dira. Very, very nice paper. I have a question about the survey itself and the question, because my perception is that many people do not understand what is public debt itself. So the first question I would ask is, so can you give me a definition of public debt? What is public debt? Even before asking how high it is, how it could be repaid, and so on, because we know that, financial literacy is very low in general, even in advanced countries. So my understanding is that, my prior is that many people will not know what is public debt. The second question is about Japan, because in your chart comparing actual debt and perception, I mean, Japan clearly stands as an outlier because there is a big gap between the two. So is there anything specific about Japan? And does the fact that debt in Japan is predominantly held domestically, as opposed to, for example, Latin American country where debt is held abroad, play a role? Also because, probably the coverage in the media about sustainability, public debt, and so on is lower in a country where debt is held domestically, as opposed to Latin American and other countries which are more exposed to foreign shocks. Thanks a lot.
Very, very nice paper, Francesco and co-authors, and it's really informative to see what the perceptions of the public are. I had a comment related to, we saw in Eric's discussion these multiple consolidations in France, to the point that it looks like that pretty much every budget in France is a consolidation. And that kind of raises the question of how meaningful these consolidations are, and whether really this should be the kind of variable of interest there. So on kind of two comments related to that. The first is just kind of practical for you, is maybe looking at experiences of kind of debt crises and how they change your perception. Because that's a real, consolidation, who knows what that really means. But a debt crisis is something real. I'm sure that, in Greece following the crisis and the UK after even the mini budget crisis, perceptions really changed. And I'm not even sure in which direction, but they definitely would have changed. The other kind of more policy-related comment is, a point I've been making for some time now is that a negative side effect of the fiscal rules in Europe and UK and elsewhere is I think that they have disincentivized real consolidation, real reform, because it, what it incentivizes is the really piecemeal measures to just meet the whatever 3% deficit target. So you do that one little tax in your budget that will get you to your make you be within your fiscal envelope. But then the way we used to deal with this is to have these episodic, very large tax reforms and or expenditure reforms, and I think that has been disincentivized in the current policy framework.
Can you pass it back to Philip, please? Okay, Philip, then Marius, then Sebastian.
Yeah, thank you very much. Philip Rother from the ECB. Two questions. On the political side, you do ask for political orientation, but in the current political environment, what may be much, or at least as important, is the degree of political fragmentation. Are people willing to compromise? And that is what is key for any consolidation, that they find a way to compromise. And apparently in many democracies this is being eroded. So maybe that's something to also check into. Another technical question on the treatments. Of course, things seem to be significant. But what is the size of the effect? Does it really matter? Does it make much of a difference, or is it just a low effect? It's significant, but it just doesn't change much. Thank you very much.
To Marius, please.
Thank you. Amazing paper. I really love the wealth of information that we get from this. I think we understand very little about how people actually think about these issues. And I'm thinking in the Greek experience, I think one of the benefits of the fiscal consolidation is that people started understanding that there's an intertable budget constraint. In the 80s and the 90s, most of the Greeks were getting salaries, benefits, subsidies, with a lot of debt accumulating, and they couldn't understand. So I think maybe a good part of fiscal consolidations is understanding what's going on. It's an information treatment in some sense. The other part that, maybe it's for the next paper, or you raise my appetite. It's fiscal consolidations are an interesting policy experiment in the sense that the direct effect is visible and you understand it. It's a negative effect on your, on your wallet, okay? And all the good stuff about fiscal consolidation are very, in the future through supply sides and equilibrium effects. So things that may materialize but may be harder, to trust they will happen and so on. And I would wonder if, if we were to look from households that maybe are thinking more about the short run, and we were to look at firms, investment, and FDI, if that kind of the good part is more easily understood by them, or and I think that's important to understand whether at the end of the day we should expect, in the short run something bad, but in the long run, investment growth may be driven more by these things. Thank you.
Okay, Sebastian here in front, and let's try to keep the last three questions more short, please, so we give a few seconds to Francesco.
Sure. So it's a very interesting and rich set of results. So on your very first result, kind of this evidence for seemingly lack of understanding of the government budget constraint. So do we know from the literature on financial literacy whether households have a better understanding of their own budget constraint? In comparing these, that would give us some evidence on whether it's really kind of a lack of understanding of basic accounting or something else like terminology or general equilibrium effects. Thanks.
Evie at the back, please.
I am glad because two of my comments are already addressed, so I will just say one thing. So here, I think that we also have to think about commitment versus discretion, in the sense that, you might have high government turnover in the countries that you're looking at. So like people, they don't keep track because, there's no commitment, lack of commitment from the part of the government. I will let you know about the rest when we break.
On the other side, Leo, please.
Super interesting paper. Again, now to be very quick, if the idea is, to test what people understand intertemporally or also intergenerationally, why not including a question more directly to aspects of the pension system? For example, asking them whether they expect current funding, the retirement age to go up or down. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be surprised if the priors are not too bad, because fiscal is a very general term, but in many countries we have a very intense public debate currently about aspects of the pension system. And then the other question mentioned also by Eric, if public debt gets too high, and then this inflationary way out that may loom. On this, there's parallel literature, and in Germany, for example, experiencing at least two hyperinflations at the beginning of the 20th century. This has not been, remembered by people who went through this, but this has been passed on intergeneration across generations, right? So this is there's a link, right?
Thanks, Leo. Let's give 2 minutes.
Yeah.
No. Maybe you can continue. No?
These were all great comments. So let me start from, first of all, thanks a lot to Eric. I think he also did a great job in further connecting to the existing literature, to policy, economic implications, the policy implications. So that was a great discussion. I think I don't have much to answer there, but thanks for making all these very, very valid points. And the questions were, I think, more like very good comments. So let me briefly try to address, starting from the last one. Yeah, I agree that a lot of the debate actually is about retirement age. We have implicitly some of it when we think about benefits going up or down, but it's fair enough that it's not exactly the same if people expect the retirement age to change. The commitment versus discretion, I agree that part of the distrust might be that whoever makes decisions today is not going to be responsible for the consequences. Sebastian, I think it's a good point to check whether people understand their own budget constraint. I mean, as opposed to the government budget constraint. My primary would be yes, but it's just not informed. So we can look at, yes, in the literature and see if we have some evidence on this. Mario's point, yeah, I totally agree on this idea that perhaps a debt crisis is a teaching moment. Was that maybe Jacopo that was saying, or Ethan? Somebody said, yeah, Ethan, saying, oh, maybe you should check more debt crisis instead of fiscal consolidations. Because fiscal consolidations, I think they definitely have this flavor of like a recurrent small measure that we do repeatedly. And this connects very well with what you were saying about fiscal rules. So fiscal rules in Chile, for example, they seem to work much better, for which they're supposed to run a primary surplus during good times and a primary deficit during bad times. Instead, the way they are designed in Europe, they might very well backfire because you always try to be on the boundary, on this limit that you have. Philip raised some good points about political fragmentation. I think it's really a problem. Yes, I think that it's not that just people have different opinions, it's just they perceive the other side as an enemy. I don't want to say everybody, but definitely a larger share of the population than in the past. And there are some sociological issues here that have to do with, anyway, it's a much broader conversation about what was keeping us together versus why things have changed recently. And Mario's point on you don't see the benefit of fiscal consolidation, so more in general or reforms, definitely. I think people totally miss the general equilibrium effects. I think it's always this idea it's going to come at my expenses, and I don't really see the benefits. Jacopo, Anno wrote a paper called What About Japan? Because Japan always stands out, and there are two key things about Japan. The first one is that the way they report debt is different than other countries. So the number might be, the headline number that they report might be misleading. Nevertheless, they still have high debt to GDP ratio even when you do the proper accounting. And in part they do, and that's the paper by Hanno, massive fiscal repression. So I think it's very much related to what you're saying. Is mostly domestically held, and essentially it's retirees that are financing the government. I think it was in your discussion that there was this idea, oh, does everything has to be present discounted value of future primary surpluses?
Yeah,
no?
exactly.
Yeah, that's part of it. Of course, how you discount these shows up in there with the convenience yield. There were a lot of other good points, but I feel like I'm already like a minute over, so I should probably stop here. But thanks for all the comments and questions.
Thank you very much.